Rob Zombie can be a difficult guy to talk about, for the simple reason that everyone's got their own incredibly strong opinions about him and his work. From my experience, those opinions tend to boil down to either your hardcore horror fans who love him and his style and his unapologetically grungy and visceral films for whom he's one of the greats, or else there's a whole other faction that can't stand him, his approach to movie making, the fact that he always dumps all the same shit and the same people in his films, and even that he's a guy with a stupid made-up name. And that means that the minute you start talking about his films with anyone, especially I should say this is true of his Halloween films, you can't pass judgment without taking sides on Zombie himself. You either love him or you hate him, and therefore it's hard to get into a civil debate about anything that the guy's done, and the relative merits of the films themselves. It's hard to get past that initial thing of needing to take sides. So it's worth saying that, as I know that I'm straying into something of a battle zone here, I'm really neither in one camp nor the other. There's things I like about his films, and then there's things that I don't like about them. When he tries to be too much like Tarantino, for example, when you've got loads of pop culture references and kind of self-aware, ironically bleak humour and trendily immoral characters who we're supposed to enjoy hanging out with, I'm less fond of those films, just because I think those sort of films are pretty easy to do. And I think that Rob Zombie can be a lot better when he's being himself and not just kind of copying the flavour of the month. Because for me, the best thing Rob Zombie ever did was 2012's Lords of Salem, which I actually think is about 85 to 90% of a perfect film, which captured a very specific style and tone fantastically, and proved that Rob Zombie could, if he put his mind to it, make basically the last film that anyone would have expected him to make, and to do it extremely well. So, I'm not going to take sides here. I'm not that interested in kind of factional warfare between people who've got these rigidly entrenched opinions. I take each of his films on their own merit, and I reserve making hyperbolic judgments of the guy, which I like to think is the sensible thing to do. But what I will say is this. When word first broke that Rob Zombie was directing a new Munsters film, I think, like everyone else in the world, I was waiting for the punchline. It seemed like the most confrontationally implausible fit of a director known for making extremely violent, brutal and gory films with a movie version of a big silly live-action cartoon made for children. It's the sort of project that just shouldn't exist. It's the kind of hell freezes over nightmare-made reality that's enough to make you think that we've slipped over into some terrifying alternate dimension where nothing is what it seems and all logic and order and common sense is completely out the window. Rob Zombie directing a film of the Munsters just shouldn't exist. And yet, when you stop and think about it, maybe it's not that crazy. If you judge Rob Zombie by his films, then you get the image of a guy who's drawn to extreme Nazi stuff, this nihilistic heavy metal dude with a Manson fetish and a very low opinion of the human race. And yet, you hear him talk, and Rob Zombie himself has, for as little as it's been obvious from looking at his films to date, always spoken about being one of that generation of monster kids, of growing up watching old black and white horror films on TV, and of reading Famous Monsters of Filmland and all the rest of those particular cliches. We all know he's a massive fan of, for example, Nosferatu, but he's also a fan of much more ephemeral stuff like The Munsters, whose influence you can see in his music, which I admit I know absolutely nothing about, because I've got a real cloth ear for that kind of stuff. But Rob Zombie is, it turns out, a fairly sincere fan of the Munsters, and as implausible as it sounds, he's actually gone and made a film that tries to recreate some of that comic panel goofy monster fun on screen in glorious, garish colour. And the crazy thing is, he's not done too bad a job of it. So first things first, one of the hardest things to deal with in this particular film is trying to think exactly why a Rob Zombie Munsters film exists. Okay, so obviously it's something of a passion project. It's doubtful that just anyone would have wanted to make this particular film. The fact that it exists at all is down to Rob Zombie himself and his self-confessed love for these particular characters. Well, that's fine, because that's a much less cynical angle to come at rebooting a franchise than the usual studio-led approach of looking through the books to see what past IPs can be milked for the most money whilst putting in the least effort. Rob Zombie isn't making a Munsters film because he's been offered a big gig by a studio, he's making a Munsters film because he wants to make a Munsters film. Because even though it does have a fan base, and to be honest, I've seen a few episodes over the years, the Munsters isn't an easy sell, especially not in a form that tries its best to be as faithful to the original as possible. It's not the kind of property that's just crying out for a reboot, to get the Munsters back into the multiplexes and to get the characters back into a state where new merch can be made. The Munsters is quite deliberately old-fashioned, in a way that really resists any attempts to modernise it, or to reinvent it in any kind of self-consciously relevant or grounded way. And to be honest, that's one of the things that I like the most about it, because that is such a rare thing these days. Because The Munsters, the original series, was an affectionate, silly comedy that was based on a love of the Universal monster films, in the same way that Rob Zombie's Munsters is based on a love of the original Munsters series. Now, it's difficult when you're talking about the Munsters not to bring up the Addams Family, because the two are so intricately connected, with even the creator of the Munsters admitting to basically just ripping off the Addams Family, which I'll be honest, I always thought was the better of the two series. The Addams Family was wittier and funnier and a bit less obviously slapstick, whereas the Munsters kind of overdid things a bit and leaned much more heavily into just costumes and makeup for its gags. Both the Munsters and the Addams Family had, fundamentally, the same central idea at their core, which was about celebrating difference and peculiarities. And that for all their ghoulish weirdness, our central characters think that they're perfectly normal, and that it's actually everyone else that's really weird. And for a lot of people, it was that outsider mentality, with or without the campy goth paint job, that they connected with. Because we're all strange and fucked up in our own ways, we've all got our own pleasures and rituals and kinks and fascinations. The Munsters just highlighted that and said that it was okay to be weird, and that was great. The difference with the Addams Family, though, was that they seemed to be a totally normal family who just acted weird, whereas the Munsters were literally just a family of monsters. So they took the central idea of the Addams Family and stripped away any subtlety or metaphors and just made it as literal as possible. So in the case of the Munsters, you go in thinking, well, how hard can it be to do the Munsters right? Because it's not the high benchmark of a classic piece of 60s pop culture. The Munsters was basically a live-action horror-flavoured cartoon for children with some instantly recognisable imagery, a cool theme tune, and some fairly feeble gags. It's hard to sneer down your nose at a new Munsters film for being a little bit shit, because to be honest, the original was never high art. So, is it really possible to fuck up the Munsters that badly? Maybe. But I think once you adjust yourself to the Rob Zombie film's set of characters, once you get a feel for the style of the whole thing, then you'll find that it's doing a decent enough job of just rattling along with a string of deliberately creaky, broad gags, and I think that's fine, because, to be honest, that's exactly what the Munsters is. What's more interesting is thinking about the film as a whole, as Rob Zombie's The Munsters, and asking yourself, well, what exactly do we gain from this being a Rob Zombie film? Because it's a film that's been made by somebody who obviously loves the original series and has tried to put some of that love on screen. The question is, though, and this goes right back to that initial reaction of what the fuck I had when I first heard about the film, when you realise that this is so very different to the sort of film that Rob Zombie usually makes, and that he isn't really bringing any of the very distinctive flavour that his other films have got to the Munsters for obvious reasons, is this the kind of film that could have been made by just literally anybody that quite liked the original series? Now, if there's one key thesis that I've developed when it comes to films, it's that the best films are those that tend to come from a central creative force, a filmmaker with their own singular vision. I think the best films are usually the ones made by creatives with a very personal and distinctive voice that becomes totally enmeshed in the film itself until the finished product is a film that really couldn't have been made by anybody else. Think of how much Halloween is a pure John Carpenter film, or how much Hellraiser is ripped from the very soul of Clive Barker himself. And Rob Zombie is very much a guy whose films have all got a very distinct authorial voice to them. You totally know a Rob Zombie film when you're in it. What's interesting then is that it's that voice that's almost entirely missing from the Munsters, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that this is Rob Zombie's only real family film to date, just because you naturally think of Rob Zombie as being someone that operates only at the extreme end of hardcore brutal horror. So if you take that away, you slap a PG rating on and get Rob Zombie to direct an adaptation of someone else's characters, by the way the first time he's done a remake or reboot since his Halloween films, then what are you left with? Well, you're left with a guy who likes the Munsters. That's okay, but there's plenty of examples of fans getting a chance to direct a version of something that they profess to love and really cocking it up horribly. Just being a fan isn't enough. You need to be able to bring life to what you're doing and to make it special in a way that can convince you that there's any point in this particular project even existing. Though, I'll say it again, Rob Zombie's The Munsters is not in any way a cynically made film. So the most superficial thing, though, that Rob Zombie brings to the table is his rep company of actors, people that he's worked with in the past, often for multiple films. Because Rob Zombie is very much a guy who likes to rely on familiar talents when casting his films, sprinkled liberally with a couple of golden age greats. Like, for example, you've got Catherine Schell from Space 1999 and City of Death here, and of course the brilliant Sylvester McCoy. But one of the things that sets Rob Zombie apart from a lot of directors who often reuse similar people is how he tends to cast the same people in everything he does as the leads. Now, that can be fine, and I totally get why he does it. The problem is that most of the main cast in this are Rob Zombie regulars, and a lot of them are playing characters from the Munsters series. Where that's a problem is that rather than being in a position to tailor a script to suit the abilities of his regular collaborators, Rob Zombie has cast a big screen sitcom reboot using a cast of people who are used to acting tough in grungy, foul-mouthed gore films, who haven't really ever done any significant amount of comedy before, instead of just trying to get the best and funniest people for the job. That means that what we end up with is quite an eccentrically cast film that's led to a lot of critics saying that this feels like Rob Zombie just playing dress-up with a lot of his mates, that there's never a feeling that this is a sincere attempt by those actors to play this particular group of characters, because they seem so ill-suited to their roles in a lot of cases. The strange thing for me, though, was seeing who got a sense of the overall project and pitched their performances right, and who was left totally high and dry. Naturally, because The Munsters is an ensemble piece, you'll find that some of the cast work for you and others don't. Of the zombie regulars, I think Sherry Moon is fun as Lily, I actually thought she did a good job, and Daniel Roebuck is almost note perfect as Grandpa. But the biggest surprise for me was Richard Brake. Now, I actually happen to think that Richard Brake is genuinely one of the best character actors in the genre at the moment. I think he's brilliant and he's always an absolute joy to watch no matter what he's in. He's one of the few actors in horror in the last 10 years or so, when horror's got really small and intimate and low-key, who you could genuinely think of as this brilliant, charismatic personality who just lights up the screen. What I think is amazing, though, is that of everyone in this film, Richard Brake really is spectacularly awful. I mean, really desperately unfunny, overdone and embarrassing, stuck with this weird fake upper-class English accent, which is strange because despite being what you'd think of as your quintessential southerner, he's actually Welsh. And I think his performance is the worst in the whole film, which really knocked me back a bit because I've never seen a poor Richard Brake performance before, let alone a really terrible one.
It's your bloody problem now, mate.
On the other end of the scale, showing the benefits of not just going for the same group of actors, but actually specifically setting out to find somebody funny and quirky who will work in a Munsters film, is Sylvester McCoy as Igor, who I think is actually by far the funniest character in the whole film. Sylvester McCoy, for those of you who don't know, was of course, and technically in some capacity still is, the 7th Doctor Who, and he's a really strange, hard to pin down little sprite of a guy. You can always rely on to be unpredictable in a way that's very entertaining. But as well as casting, there's other things that Rob Zombie brings to the table that I suppose you could attribute to the specificity of his own filmmaking style. there's tons of pop culture and monster cinema references on display, as well as a few musical set pieces, none of which, to be honest, are things that work for me. Once again, the obvious defence is, well, it's the Munsters, isn't it? But for me, there's moments of slightly too self-aware goofiness that add nothing, and I think that all the charm comes from the scenes where it actually feels like the actors believe in what they're doing, that they're selling the wackiness in as straight-laced a way as possible, because that's really the only way you can do this sort of thing, without it all collapsing under the weight of its own campiness. I think the fact that it's also got this really heavy-handed galumphing comedy music on the soundtrack at all times gets quite wearing, and makes it seem lamer than it actually is. Having really crude comedy music on all your funny scenes doesn't make anything funnier, it just makes it seem like you don't believe in what you're doing, that you don't believe that the audience has the common sense to know that they're supposed to find this funny. There are definitely as well moments that feel hugely over the top though, and again, I get it, it's the Munsters, it's not meant to be subtle. What I'll say though is this, that rather than feeling like an accurate representation of the heart and style of that 60s TV sitcom, there's times when the Munsters has got the feel of one of those terribly bloated mid-90s films, when suddenly films, especially films based on popular franchise IPs, were suddenly getting way too much money thrown at them, and you get these really huge, godly, over-designed sets, and flashy lighting, and way too elaborate camera work, where millions were spent on production designs and props, and costumes, and bells and whistles, rather than actually coming up with a decent script, or actually telling a decent story. Now, the production design in the Munsters has got some of that 90s feel, admittedly on a smaller scale, where you kind of think, okay, it's fine they've spent loads of time on designing these very elaborate sets and angles and fancy setups. But is this any funnier than the original, doing basically these same gags for a fraction of the budget in black and white on a little 60s TV set? Because there's nothing in the Munsters in any version that gets funnier because it's had loads of money chucked at it. Big sets aren't funny. The Munsters is inherently a small and rather cheap looking prospect, and the odd moments of lurish technicolor garishness that you get just make you think that it's got delusions of grandeur, when in reality its heart is actually quite simple and small and goofy. And to be honest, that's what I like about it, because beneath that production design, which is fairly overblown, there's a playful silliness to everything that does feel affectionate. So I suppose the question is, does this work as a film in its own right? Could you show this to somebody that's never seen the Munsters before, maybe even to a child, and expect them to get it and think it was funny? Well, what's interesting is that I'm not convinced that that is the target audience for this film. See, one of the first bits of marketing for the Munsters was a clip that you actually see in the end credits of the finished film itself, and it's essentially a shot-for-shot reconstruction of the opening credits scene of the TV show. Now, if you didn't know that, if you were a young kid just watching that scene play out in the film, it doesn't mean anything to you. If you know the original, then this is a totally faithful reconstruction of that credit scene, even down to the costumes and the set. And it's Rob Zombie's way of saying that he understands it, that he's coming from a place of love, and that he's saying, don't worry, I'm doing this right, this matters to me. And that's a very nice, genuine fanish sentiment in the age of how do we update this for modern audiences. So the obvious conclusion you draw from that is that Rob Zombie's The Munsters, for the fact that it does have a PG rating, is ultimately a film that's not concerned with rebooting the Munsters. It's a total love letter to the past for all the monster kids who have grown up and really aren't at all represented in today's genre films. If you love 80s slashers or 80s teen movies, or fuck it, just the 80s in general, there's dozens of genre directors paying homage to the stuff that you're into. But the monster kids were the original horror fandom, the ones that started it all, and they are very rarely even spoken about anymore by today's genre fans. For them, stuff like the Munsters was special because hey, it was the Universal Monsters on primetime network TV. It took horror proudly into the nation's families and let everybody see just how cool it was. And that's really the whole idea that's at the heart of the Munsters, celebrating difference and strangeness, not laughing at people because they're weird and aren't into the same horribly bland stuff as everyone else, but embracing that weirdness and finding happiness in it. And that's what's so much fun about this particular iteration of the Munsters, because it is totally its own thing, because it is different. It's not just updating these characters in the same obvious ways that every other IP is updated for modern audiences. It's a strange, quirky, rough around the edges love letter to a series that was quirky and rough around the edges and fun in a way that's got absolutely zero pretensions. It might not be the funniest comedy ever made for sure. It's feeble, it's heavy-handed, but in quite an earnest and sweet way. But what really matters is that it's totally a film that could only have been made by Rob Zombie. Not because it's a film that displays the obvious flavour of his other work, but because he's the only one that's confident enough in his own love of the Munsters to make something that's this big and colourful and, to be honest, goofy. Because films just don't look this bright, they're not this energetic anymore, and maybe only somebody that's secure enough in their own skin like Rob Zombie would actually have the balls to do the Munsters like this. It's not a bold reinvention of the franchise, and nor should you expect it to be. But in today's landscape of, ironically, zombified remakes and bland, stripped-down, self-important, take-out-all-the-fun reboots and corporatised homogeneity, this is exactly how you should do the Munsters. With love and a sense of reverence for the original, with the understanding that you're making, at the end of the day, a bright, frothy cartoon rather than pompously setting out to turn a children's programme into some worthy, important film, and most importantly of all, with the courage to be different and to be quirky, and not just to be the same as everyone else. Because that's really what the Munsters is, and always has been, about.